sure.
Right. So, if I get this straight, you're a UKIP supporter. Is that it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So you support Labour then? And would Jeremy Corbyn be your preferred candidate?
Yeah. His policies are pretty matched up with my views on ideology. So,
Right.
uh, yeah,
So, like, there are a few things that he's said over the past few months, and this is really an outsider perspective. I don't know what the usual is in UK politics, like what the established usual is, but a few things that he said over the past few months strike me as kind of odd at the least, and actually quite dangerous at the most. One of the things would be he's characterized Fidel Castro as a champion of social justice, and Fidel Castro, right, was this brutal dictator in Cuba who succeeded in starving his people. He arrested political prisoners, things like that. He was basically just an all-around communist dictator. And either Corbyn doesn't know this and he's an idiot, or he is actually in favor of the things Castro did, which would be, starving people, imprisoning them. And in that case, he shouldn't be allowed to govern either. So I just wanted to get your view on this. Like, have you seen, and.
well, I think it's dangerous to say that he agrees with the stuff Castro has done. I mean, obviously, I don't agree with anything that Castro has done to his people.
Right.
Um, but I think what Corbyn was thinking about there, and I don't think he should have said it, but I think he was thinking more in terms of pure ideology, to be honest.
Hmm.
But the thing is, you get a lot of things that Corbyn said, that the right wing media in the UK, for example, are saying a lot of stuff about Corbyn that he said in the past. For example, when the IRA was very active in their terrorist bombings and stuff, he held negotiations with a political party called Sinn Féin in Ireland,
Yeah.
and to try and get to the peace process. And I think a lot of the stuff that where Corbyn seems to be in like kind of dicey situations, I've kind of been taken out of context, because he's usually, in fact, he's almost always playing a negotiator's role there.
Right. I
And
can.
in the case of Castro, I think he was wrong to say that, but I can kind of see where he's coming from.
Yeah, and I can put my sources in the chat like after we're done, just so you can see that I didn't bullshit anything. But
Sure.
yeah, so um, I think it would be fair to say in some instances that he could have been presenting himself in different ways to different people in order to be a negotiator. I mean, that's probably usual, but for some of the things he said, it's pretty hard to. Oh, there's Tim putting the sources in for me,
Yeah.
and it's from the Guardian. Good. Um, right. So yeah, I think. Sorry, yeah, I was about to say Castro. Corbyn in the past has actually been favored. Sorry, not favored. Has favored Islamic terrorist groups and not just Irish terrorist groups. Um, I think it was either the Mujahideen or another one of the early variants of terror organization. But
I assume you're talking about Hamas.
right, Hamas. That's the one in
Yeah.
Israel. And he was speaking favorably about them, and I don't think it's responsible necessarily for a political figure to be speaking favorably about um, a terror organization. I mean, even if they were unfairly treated by Israel, that's another story. But I think both are pretty bad.
Yeah. I mean, I think I go back to the point of saying Corbyn said those things not necessarily because he believed them, but because he was really trying to force a peace settlement there. Uh, I mean, obviously, what he said was, I think, fully against his own values. He probably didn't want to say them. Certainly, the stuff with Hamas, but
Yeah,
yeah, I kind of think he. Bear in mind, this was sort of like 10 years ago, 20 years ago as well. He's been active for ages. But yeah, when you're looking at what Corbyn said in the past, it's very easy to say, oh well, he's clearly a terrorist sympathizer or whatever. Quite often, more often than not, it's the opposite. For example, he heavily opposed the war in Iraq. Tony Blair wanted us to go there. He spared the campaign, and look at the results sort of coming from there. We've had ISIS come into
Right.
mainstream media a lot more. So I think that side of Corbyn needs to be looked at a lot more than the other side of Corbyn, where he's saying perhaps not necessarily deplorable things, but certainly things that I wouldn't agree with about terror organizations, just so he can force some sort of peace settlement.
Right. So it's not just Corbyn that I have a problem with in the Labour Party, because there are other figures who are actually worse than Corbyn, in my view, because there's this one guy, John McDonnell, who would be, I think, the finance something
Shadow
or other.
Chancellor, yeah.
Yeah, right, the Shadow Chancellor. And he's a self-proclaimed Marxist. Like in one of the interviews he did a couple of years ago, I think it was back in 2005, but it recently resurfaced. He said that he was a Marxist, and this is on tape, and he's been waiting for the crash of capitalism for years, which is how he put it. And recently he was representing Corbyn at I think it was supposed to be a union rally, but what ended up happening is a lot of actual Stalinists showed up to the rally and started waving hammer and sickle flags. And you have John McDonnell standing under like hammer and sickle flags, like raising his fist and saying solidarity with all these communists. And I don't think that's a really great way for Labour to present themselves. And I would be really perturbed if something like that was happening here in the United States. I couldn't even imagine if, say, Theresa May was standing under swastikas, with a bunch of neo-Nazis and saying, like, burn the Jews or something. Like that, I think she would be torn apart in that scenario, but it's just very strange.
I've seen the tape you referenced there. Again, I think that was sort of 12 years ago now, 2005. I know that he said he was, what was it, Marxist, not Stalinist, but like Marxist. But
right.
Even so, I think that's still pretty bad. But that being said, when you're in a crowd of sort of communists and socialists, you're going to say stuff like to get them on side. If you're not going to get them on side, then you're not going to have a very good sort of relationship with them in the future. A lot of the stuff the Labour Party is that it really struggles to get massive amounts of money. The Conservative Party has a lot of big finance backers. The Labour Party is very much grassroots. The membership, for example, pays most of the fees for the election. And so when you're trying to get this sort of funding, it's very difficult not to get yourself into situations where you may look back on it and think, oh, well, this wasn't very good. Certainly, John McDonnell, I know, he's definitely hard left. He's definitely one of Corbyn's main guys. But I think more often than not, certainly in UK politics, you've got to look at it from a standpoint of, okay, what's the kind of ulterior motive here? He's obviously doing it for some sort of reason. And more often than not, especially if it's at a union, it'll be for funding in some way. That's not me saying I agree with what he's saying. It's just I can understand why perhaps he's doing this sort of thing.
Well,
same with Corbyn.
If you're saying that he doesn't want to burn any bridges, if that's what you're saying, right?
Well, not necessarily burn any bridges, but remember that the fact that video, that tape resurfaced from 2005, it's been underground for that amount of time. He obviously didn't think it would get out into the public eye. So I guess that's probably why he was more open about it there.
Yeah, I would say that in the case of mingling with communists or radical socialists, I would say those aren't really people that you would want to have as political allies, because I could look at it from the other side of the spectrum. If, say, a moderate right-wing politician was mingling with Nazis, then I don't think they would want to have the Nazis on their side. Like, if I was running as a politician and I found myself in a crowd of Nazis, campaigning, I would hightail it the hell out of there. I wouldn't sit there and say, yeah, burn the Jews, and then like later on say, well, I was just trying to be nice in the in the present. Like,
I get that. I think it's slightly different with right-wing politics in a sense, certainly in the UK, because the UK is a very reserved place generally politically. I think the reason we've had the rise of sort of Corbyn and the hard left and the Labour Party is because for so long Labour has been sort of centre, full of like, I don't know if I heard the term Blairites, and
right.
Yeah. But it's been very, so I think that's how Jeremy Corbyn organised his campaign. I think that's why he filled it with so many hard left kind of politicians, because the Labour Party is a very diverse area of sort of centre left to far left kind of politics, and I think that needs to be considered when you're looking at these kind of things. It's Big Tent kind of policies.
Yeah, I think Britain on the whole is a bit more left wing than America, like
Yeah,
altogether,
definitely.
because your Conservative Party would be more comparable to our Democrats, actually. And by the way, your Conservatives suck. They're the worst Conservatives. Like
Yeah.
seriously, I I'm if I was in your position, well, not in your position, but if I was in the UK during the election, I would have voted for Theresa May, but not because I think she's a good candidate. She's probably really stupid, but I wouldn't feel responsible voting for Labour, seeing as number one, I disagree with their policy, and number two, I think a lot of them are actually communists, as evidenced by John McDonnell. Um,
Well, I
yeah,
mean, as I said, I don't think they're communist. I don't think they're communist. Certainly, Jeremy Corbyn isn't communist. I think he's definitely socialistic in his views. John McDonnell is a kind of an exception now. I don't think John McDonnell is a communist. I know as I take from saying he's a Marxist, but I still don't believe he really is. So if you look at the shadow cabinet as a whole for Labour, it's as I say, it is very diverse. There's a diverse range of views there, and as a whole, I think if you saw Labour getting into government, it would be more centre left to left rather than far left, because sort of the hard left and centre in the party are kind of balanced out to get centre left kind of policies.
right.
But coming back to kind of Theresa May, I think the whole reason at the moment she's a dead woman walking. She's interim. She's kind of like an interim prime minister. I don't know why she didn't just resign at the moment.
And she looks like a vampire.
She genuinely does. But the whole reason she called this election is because she thought Jeremy Corbyn looks weak. We've got a 24-point lead in the polls. We can absolutely destroy them here. And now that she's realised that she's not the strong leader that she thought she was, that Jeremy Corbyn is actually quite a viable alternative for Britain. Certainly, as demonstrated in the results, with Labour gaining seats, Conservatives losing their majority and having to do sweet deals with the DUP.
Yeah.
I think the political landscape in Britain has certainly changed. And if there were to be another election tomorrow, I think that Labour would probably quite comfortably win.
I don't know if they win, but I don't know. Like
The opinion polls would suggest so, but I mean they're opinion polls,
Well.
so
I don't know, but I don't know much about this DUP party that the Conservatives are now allied with. I've heard they're neo-Nazis or something like that, but
and not neo-Nazis, just like kind of hardcore creationists, hard
okay.
right, kind of like the right wing area of the Republican Party. I would compare it to, which a lot of people aren't really happy. The common consensus in the UK at the moment is that Theresa May is putting power over country interests. She's doing everything she can to keep hold of power because she knows that if another election were called, there is a possibility that the Conservatives would just lose outright.
Well, if she was so worried about power, she wouldn't have put out that shit manifesto now, would she?
Well, she didn't know it was going to be so poorly received, obviously, and that was very much on her advisors, who have now been sacked. But I mean, the whole manifesto thing. If you compare the Labour manifesto and the Conservative manifesto is very much just business as usual. And I think after Brexit, the Conservatives didn't think that the political landscape had shifted so much to more radical policies, and I think that's why Labour did so well. The Conservatives just weren't offering anything really to anyone. I mean, they were just thinking of more cutting, and that time and time again has been a very unpopular policy.
Right.
And that comes back to the whole thing of whether you need to invest in public services to stimulate the economy, which is what Labour believes, or if you want to continue to cut public services and raise taxes on the majority of people while cutting it for the wealthiest, and then have kind of trickle down economics, which is what the Conservatives are proposing. And what we've seen is a decrease in living standards, decrease in the quality of care from the NHS, for example, and it's led to a lot of public anger.
Well, I think the opposite of trickle down economics, which would be tax the rich to hell and then like raise the wages and all that. That wouldn't do much good either, because then you'd have an artificial rise in the price of labor and things like that. So honestly, it might be two extremes. I'm not sure, but on the policy issue with Corbyn, there was one other thing that I heard about him that really made me kind of confused about whether he has a brain or not. And that's when he was talking about nuclear weapons. And he says, I would never use nuclear weapons. Even if someone else fired them at our country, I wouldn't even push the button. And I'm thinking, well, that just saying that completely demolishes the point of the nuclear deterrent. Now someone actually might try to nuke Britain, now that they know you're not going to retaliate, Corbyn. Like, that's a pretty dumb thing to say.
Well, I think it's seriously unlikely anyone would nuke the UK just because Jeremy Corbyn said a few things like that. I know that he's totally against Trident, which is the nuclear deterrent, and I don't don't really see what the problem is here. If he's not going to use it, that's quite a good thing, isn't it? I mean, would you rather go back to days of mutually assured destruction with the Cold War?
Yes, that's what prevented the Cold War from being hot.
Well, yes, but the thing is, now that the Soviet Union is gone, America and Russia are slowly getting rid of their nuclear weapons. Wouldn't it be better to take a more radical step now into a more sort of progressive age? I suppose certainly in Europe. I mean, with Trump being elected and all that, maybe not so much in America, but certainly to take steps to such a big country as Britain to completely disarm their nuclear weapons, follow kind of the Australian route, the Canadians. Did I hear that? Or was it the South Africans?
I don't think the Canadians had nuclear weapons.
It was, I think the British stockpiled them there for a while. Actually, but
maybe.
Yeah, that'd be it. But yeah, to take that route, I think I can only see it as a positive thing. To be honest, I can't see, certainly with the UK being allied with America, which isn't going to get rid of its nuclear weapons anytime soon. I can't really see what bad's going to come out of it. Bearing in mind that the cost to a new Trident is just ridiculous. I mean, it's a good portion of public spending is going to something that in all likelihood is never going to be used. And certainly a big argument in the EU referendum debate was, oh yes, we should leave so we can fund the NHS properly. Well, if you want to fund the NHS properly, you don't spend all the money on nuclear weapons. That's just completely counterproductive, isn't it?
Well, we'll get to the Brexit debate, but I think with nuclear weapons, having nukes is actually a good thing for a country, because it means that they can never really be defeated. And if you have the nuclear deterrent, there's a lot less chance of a war happening. And even if someone does fire a missile at you, and the point of responding with the missile is, well, Corbyn would say, oh no, well, we don't want to kill any of their citizens, we just, we don't want to cause any more death and suffering. But that's the point. If you disable the country that shot you, then they won't shoot anyone else, right? It's protecting the rest of the world. And with nuclear weapons, the deal, if you were to completely disarm, then there would be no nuclear deterrent, and no deterrent really whatsoever to invading. So, I mean, I don't really see the point in... I mean, if Corbyn wanted to have that private opinion of, well, I wouldn't, fire any nukes at any other countries, even if they were firing at me, then I guess that's fine for him to have, but don't say it out loud, because that just completely demolishes the whole point of having nukes. You might as well not have them if you say, well, you're not going to use them. So
that's why he was proposing to disarm them. It gave his words kind of more credibility. If he wanted to disarm them and saying that you've never used them, then it would make sense to say that. But I also think that the proposition that any country would ever realistically use a nuclear weapon just sort of out of the blue is just completely ludicrous. I think that at the moment the world is in kind of unstable times, as we know. So I think keep a few, but disarm who's going to be using sort of 300, 400 nuclear weapons? It's ridiculous. I mean,
maybe, but I just think that I mean, as a position, saying that you'd like to disarm is not, well, I would think it's a bad position, but it's not that bad of a position when you take everything into account. It's just saying that you wouldn't use them is completely. It's almost as if he's already disarmed, if he got elected. That is. It's like saying that is as stupid as possible thing you could say when you have nukes. But it's like walking into a room and finding a robber and taking out your handgun and saying, "I'm not going to shoot this handgun." Well, the robber's going to be like, "All right, bam." It's just a stupid thing to say. But
that comes back to that comes back to my point though, is that UK has very powerful allies. If that were to happen, the US would almost certainly step in.
Oh,
and
that's true.
It's just not going to happen. I mean, the most fragile thing to happen in Europe recently, it was the conflict in Crimea and the refugee crisis going on. No, there's not even been a whisper of like war or anything, let alone nuclear weapons. So I just think that having them now in the post-Cold War era is just very, very unnecessary. I mean, North Korea is something to keep an eye on, but they're not really going to be doing anything that I can see is going to be a credible threat. So therefore, to be stockpiling nuclear weapons like this and to be renewing it every quarter in Parliament almost unanimously, that's the Conservative Party and the Labour Party voting it through, with the exception of sort of Corbyn and a few rebels, is ludicrous, especially if there's a crisis of the deficit, which the Conservatives go on about quite a lot, and they want to bring that down, and they want to be reducing public spending to do this. Then surely it would make a lot more sense to just disarm the majority of those nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. That's the standpoint I take there.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from if you have that belief. But let's move on to Brexit, because we're already about a half hour in.
Sure.
Right. So far, and this is sort of an outsider's view, and this would be my perspective. Like, if I lived in the UK, I would definitely vote for Brexit, because a lot of the arguments for Remain seem to be these superficial, well, there's more money in this, and, if you leave, then the pound will go a little bit down in value and your house will cost a bit more. And just sort of superficial things like that are just not on the same level as the argument for Brexit. Because if you think about it, the EU has been gaining power very rapidly over the past few decades. It started as the EEC, which was just an economic agreement, and then it grew to be a political agreement, and now they're talking about having an army and borders, and having...
That's been scrapped now, by the way.
What, the army?
Yeah, that's been scrapped.
Well,
I get where you're coming from. But
I think that to have a sort of large European superstate in Europe, that the people who voted into the EU who voted Britain into the EEC to begin with, didn't even foresee this coming. I think it's a huge threat to democracy and national sovereignty, and that's on a whole different level than the value of the pound and what your house is going to cost and things like that. So that's kind of what I'm worried about with Brexit.
What about economically? What do you think are the economic benefits of voting to leave? So I get that immigration was a big issue for a lot of people that voted to leave. I think I can go on to that a bit later and why I think that's wrong. But what do you think on the economic side?
Well, again, my concerns lie with the future of democracy in Europe. But on the economics, I think the EU is really strangling Britain's potential in trade. I believe they give more into the EU than they actually get out in terms of benefits, or rather you do. And if you were free of the shackles of the EU, you could go and trade with the US and China and all these other big superpowers, which would be very willing to trade with Britain, which is one of the largest economies in the world. And I think the EU is just sort of a bureaucratic mess that's not really helping anyone, but really not helping the British people at this point.
Well, the EU, I think there's certainly an issue of bureaucracy there. However, that being said, I think the economic gains that you get from the UK are much better than then when you leave. So a big argument for the leave camp was saying, oh yes, if we leave, we get 350 million pounds a week that we would otherwise put into the EU. But what that neglects to say is that the EU in the trading that we do with the EU, we do still make a massive profit. I think it's 400 billion pounds a year, which is a very healthy profit that we're getting out from the EU. So we're going to be losing that, and instead getting this 350 million pounds a week. So we're still working out and having a massive loss. That's only going to hurt the economy.
Yeah,
Also,
but that's not everything you need to take into account. Like, after you leave the EU, you would then go and trade with other powers that the EU restricts now, and that would gain you a lot of trade, and even perhaps you would have more trading opportunities and more income if you did that rather than staying in the EU.
Well, the thing is, the EU doesn't restrict international trade to the level that I think people think. Certainly, trade with the UK and US and certainly loads of other countries is heavily dictated by sort of things inside the UN, which the EU has no restriction and no jurisdiction over. But going back to this argument of, well, if we stick to the argument of trade for the time being, I'll go back to the economy in a minute. But trade, the UK is going to be trading just as much with places like China and the US. Well, but it's going to be at a premium, because the UK, the US, and China and other countries are going to know that the UK is going to be more reliant on the trade sources that they're providing. So the gain that you get is going to be balanced out by the prices going up. And for that, the imports from the EU are obviously going to cost a lot more as well, because there's obviously the talk about leaving the single market behind in the EU, which I think would be an even bigger disaster.
Really?
Really? Yeah. Well, that's been the stance from the outset, from the Leave campaign. I think that a lot of people that voted Leave were voting so therefore under false precedences, because they were saying, oh yeah, we want to leave the EU, we don't necessarily want to leave the single market. And now there's all this talk, oh yeah, we're doing a hard Brexit, we're going to leave the single market, leave everything behind. And I think a lot of people feel betrayed in that sense, because when you voted Leave, first of all, a lot of it was a protest vote, so much like the UKIP vote in the 2015 election. But to then have politicians saying, oh yeah, we've got to leave the EU, we've got to leave the single market, we've got to leave everything behind, it's sort of a betrayal of the trust that they gained during the campaign in leaving the EU.
Well, the thing with the EU is that it hasn't always been this big, right? So you have, I forget exactly when the EEC became into existence, probably in the 60s.
70s, I think.
But the people who voted to join the EEC were told that it's only an economic alliance and it's never going to be a political alliance, and they lied. And from that point on, it's been slowly, drip, 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 more power to the EU. They need more Europe. The EU can make laws now. It has a parliament. It has, I forget, I think it's a commission, which is not accountable to the people directly. And now you have a huge political sphere, which is continually eroding national sovereignty. I know that you said that the army idea had been scrapped, but just the notion that they were considering having an EU army says to me that this is an organization which has too much power. And what you'll find is that the old people who voted for Brexit in this election, a lot of them were interviewed, and what they said was, well, we were the ones who originally voted into the EEC, and we were told that this would not be a political alliance. And they said, well, they lied to us, so we think it's in our best interest to leave now, and have Britain fully sovereign again. And I think that's the biggest issue, in my opinion. It's really an issue of national sovereignty, and the fact that in some instances the EU is not directly accountable to the demos. and that's a big opportunity for tyranny, in my opinion.
Well, the argument the EU is sort of becoming this single entity, I think, is incorrect, because the founding members of the European Commission, let's not forget, were Germany, the UK, France, Italy, and I think a couple of others there. So the UK has a very good negotiating position with the EU already. Now, if you look at I know it became a political alliance, but we have the European elections, where we can elect various politicians to go into the
Yeah,
European
but they're
Parliament
not
and
very high
fight for you.
profile, are they?
Well, no, but you get Nigel Farage going in, but I mean, he's a
Yeah.
bit of a, well, we won't go into that. But the thing is, the UK has more members of the European Parliament than almost any other country in the EU, barring sort of Germany.
Uh-huh.
So to say that we don't have a seat at the negotiating tables, and I think the testament that the EU has this massive effect over sovereignty is completely false, really, because the UK is still a sovereign nation. It makes up its own laws. It makes up its own immigration policies. It can veto any bill it likes in the EU, any bill it likes, because it does not have to take part in the free trade agreement if it doesn't want to. It does not have to take part in accepting as many refugees. As I say, it has a very strong negotiating position in these areas. So leaving the EU, what you get is you get less profit. In fact, you get a loss in trade. You get a trade deficit with the EU. You get a lack of negotiating position with the EU for the laws that would benefit the country, that would benefit our economic neighbours investing in Britain. And I think that's a great shame. I think that in voting leave, what you get is a lot more. It's a lot less than what you would get inside the EU, certainly from an economic. And I mean, the argument of sovereignty, I think, has been completely debunked now. The EU has no real control over the UK, because the UK can veto all of these things that are the risk to national sovereignty, if you like. I highly disagree with the testament of it threatening sovereignty, certainly.
Do you know the different organs of the EU government? I think one of them, I forget if it's the European Commission or the Council, but one of them has the ability to propose legislation, and the Parliament does not, right?
Yeah.
So, right,
Yes.
so
Right.
the Parliament is directly elected by the people, and that's really the only organ that is directly influenced by the people at all, because you have the Council of the European Union, not to be confused with the European Council, which I find extremely confusing because it's basically the same name, which is made up of the governments of the member country. So basically, they can propose legislation, and the people proposing legislation are not directly accountable to the demos, the voting population. And this is always a opportunity for tyranny, because you have in a functioning democracy, what you would want is for the Parliament or the Congress or the Senate, the body that's directly elected by the people, to be the ones proposing and voting on the laws. But in the EU, you don't have that. It's a very, very strange sort of bureaucratic mess of different different organs that really aren't accountable to the people at all, except for the Parliament. And it's very interesting if you look at the structure of the EU government and the structure of the Soviet Union government. They look very similar, and it's very strange how that works out. But I'm not saying that the EU is the next Soviet Union, but I'm just saying that it doesn't look like a very functioning government, in my opinion. And the fact that Germany has kind of taken over the EU in the way that it has, it kind of runs the show now. Like, Germany doesn't even have a military, and somehow it's managed to gain control in a political way of most of Europe at this point, and I find that very worrying. I don't think the British people have to uh, let the people in Brussels or in Berlin decide what their laws are. I think that's a fundamentally unfair arrangement there. So that's
Well,
sort of why I disagree with the EU on principle.
if I start with the legislative branch that you were talking about,
Right.
if you think of a government that's been elected in any country, that the government comes into power has to choose its cabinet.
Yeah.
Now the cabinet isn't elected by the people, so it's the same principle of
Yeah,
the
but the
EU.
cabinet doesn't propose legislation.
Well, it does, and it goes through Parliament. Now you think of the legislative branch in the EU, granted they're not elected, but it still has to go through the Parliament. Now, if the Parliament rejects it, then they reject it. If they pass it, then supposedly they're doing so in the interest of the wider electorate. Now, whether you agree with what they're passing or not is kind of a matter for democracy. That happens in all governments. And further to that, if you have the argument that Germany is is kind of running the show there, we've got to remember that Germany is by far the biggest economy in Europe, and wait 1 minute. And the fact that you're saying that the UK shouldn't be having laws made up in Brussels. Well, I've already kind of said that the UK doesn't have to opt into these agreements. It has a vetoing power on many, well, not all laws, but certainly many of the major laws. And the ones that are very minor generally have much better impacts for the UK because the UK is such a core part of the EU. They wouldn't give the UK a bad deal at risk of Brexit, for instance.
Well, that's another thing, actually. The UK is actually at an advantage in the Brexit negotiations as it stands, because the European Union has a lot to lose from losing one of the largest economies in the world, which is Britain, and not a lot to gain from that. So I don't think if the UK left the EU and left the single market, I don't think they'd have a bad deal at the end of it when it comes to having access to trade with the EU and things like that. I honestly think the UK, if the head of state, whoever that may be, I guess it's Theresa May now, would I think they would definitely be able to negotiate a solid deal with that. Right.
Well, this was the entire reason that Theresa May called the election. She said, "Oh yes, I need a very strong mandate, because otherwise the UK Parliament is going to slam everything down," even though it passed the Article 50 bill, sort of 512 to sort of 90 something. So it's called a super majority or something. So I don't know what she was really talking about there. And now she's been left with a hung Parliament and a weakened negotiating hand at Brussels. Yeah. Now you said that the EU has a lot to lose from the UK. That's absolutely true. But equally, the UK has a lot more to lose from losing trade deals with France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland. There's a lot more countries in the EU than merely the UK. So I think that saying that the UK are going to be in a strong position, they may have some good points, and I'm sure the EU will have to reach a compromise on many of those issues. However, at the same time, the EU aren't just going to lie down. Certainly after Theresa May's electoral flop, as it were. I mean, she's still in power, barely. But they're going to say, you've got no mandate from your own people. You're weak here. You're not offering any good deals. We're not going to lie down and give you any sort of.
I'm like 8 hours late, aren't I?
Yeah, I've already started recording it. It's fine.
Oh,
I can just email you the video afterwards, or you could give me the password to the account and I can upload it.
Oh, what software are you?
OBS.
Okay. Are you guys already started?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll give you my bad. I'll give you the password later.
All right.
I'm gonna go though. See ya.
See. Right. So anyway.
Where even was I?
Somewhere with the election, and they're gonna have not a.
Oh yeah. Okay. So Theresa May. Yes, Theresa May's got a minority Conservative government going into Brussels, and they're really at the mercy of sort of the big guns in Europe, such as Germany and France, because they haven't got that strong negotiating hand that Theresa May so desperately wanted in the election. So consequently, she's been saying a lot recently that a no deal is better than a bad deal, and a no deal is definitely a very, very bad deal for the UK. And that just shows that if she's already saying things like that, then they clearly don't have a very strong hand. They know they're not going to be able to have a very good position at the negotiating table.
Well, it's no deal is kind of better than a bad deal if you think about it, because the UK has trade opportunities outside of the EU, definitely. Like, I think you mentioned Switzerland. I don't think Switzerland is a member of the EU, unless I'm overlooking.
I made a mistake there. Yeah,
right.
It's not.
So I think Norway is a pretty strong economy that's outside the EU with all their oil and stuff. They could definitely trade with Russia, although all the sanctions would make that a little bit difficult. Places like that, I mean, China and the US are also viable trade. Honestly, I definitely think that the EU has a lot more to lose from the UK than the UK has to lose from the EU. And I know I said this already, but the fact is that it doesn't matter how much of a disadvantage Theresa May is at politically. I don't think the EU even is in the position to offer them a bad deal, or no deal rather. So,
Well, you mentioned Norway there. Norway's a very interesting example.
Yeah.
Norway never opted into the European Free Trade Agreement. Rather, they're just part of the single market as a whole. So they're outside the EU and part of the single market, which is what a lot of Leave voters wanted. Now, the UK is going to be leaving the European Union and leaving the European single market. Now, consequently, what that means, you say that we're going to be able to sort of have trade deals with the US, China, Russia.
Yeah.
Now the problem there is that there are already no restrictions on those sorts of agreements inside the EU. So that what's going to happen is, as I said earlier, the Russia, the US, all these sorts of countries are just going to be raising the tariffs. They know that the UK is going to be more reliant. They know that the UK is going to be getting a big bill from the European Union for imports there because we're going to be outside the single market. So overall, what we get is a trade deficit. We lose money every time.
It's not what I heard, but I mean, maybe. But again, the thing I'm most worried about is not trade, it's tyranny, to be honest. I think just the simple fact that the people who voted into the EEC are the same people who are voting out of the EU should definitely tell you something about the quality of the EU and how it's been going for the past few decades. I think there's definitely something to look at there, and I would be very concerned about just the fact that they had the gall to even suggest an EU army, and if they put this army into commission, it wouldn't be accountable to the people directly. It would be accountable to the European, I think, Commission or something like that. And that's something that gives way to tyranny. It leaves a bad taste in my mouth, especially when you look at history with these sorts of agreements. So
well, I think in modern times we've got to remember that the EU is wholly democratic, barring the legislative branch. Its members are elected. We've got European elections going on every 2 years in all the member states. They have a number of seats that's proportional to the input they give to the EU. So obviously the UK has quite a few seats. I'm not sure on the exact number. But so yeah, I mean, I can't really see how strengthening trade relationships while keeping national sovereignty. I mean, there's no talk of a European Union like sort of super nation, is there? It's all the countries in the EU remain sovereign. It's just that they're getting a good deal from trade relationships with other countries that the European single market and the EU brings closer together. Because if you can cooperate with member states inside the European Parliament and discuss diplomacy of trade negotiations as well as talking with lots of other EU countries at the same time, and what you get is many networks of trade deals, not just with one country, with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So in that case, everyone wins economically. The profits are much better than the deficit that you get if you're just talking individually of one country and trading like that.
Right. Okay. Before we continue, it's got to be about like 10 o'clock over there, right?
Yeah, it's just gone 10.
Can you stay for longer, or is there?
I can go for a bit longer. Maybe like 15, 20 minutes.
All right.
If that's all right.
Well, I think we've sort of exhausted our points there with the EU, because I was just going to go and repeat what I've already said. So, does anyone in the audience, the two people in the audience, have any suggestions, or do you want to go with something that they said earlier?
I don't really have any suggestions.
Well, let's switch to something non-political for a second, just to get a breather here, because this is something I read a few weeks ago in a paper. So I have this news app on my cell phone, and it compiles news from all these different sources of news, right? And I have the Telegraph as one, which is a British paper, and it was complaining that basically it was saying that men were complaining they had to wear suits to work during a 34-degree heat wave. And I found this very entertaining, because 34 degrees is not that much in the US. It's basically reaches that high pretty much every 2 weeks, so you know, where I live.
What was that in Fahrenheit? Like 90 something?
It's like 92, yeah.
Yeah. For the UK, that's pretty insane. But the thing is, in the UK, when you have heat like that, it comes with a lot of humidity, so it makes it really uncomfortable. It's not so much the heat that gets you; it's much more the humidity, because you don't really get that many clear skies, as it were. It's just there's a lot of cloud cover. Because there was a school in the UK where the boys all went dressed in skirts rather than the black trousers as protest. So yeah, I mean it was pretty bad for a couple of days. It's now raining, so you know. Obviously
in Arizona, which is basically a desert state in my country, they're having a heat wave that's 115 degrees, which is about like 45 degrees Celsius, and people's mailboxes are melting like in the heat. So I guess that's what you get for living in the desert, but it's a dry.
I mean, whenever I go to sort of Spain or Portugal or whatever, it typically gets to like sort of 40 degrees, but it's a lot more pleasant than the 34 in the UK with the high humidity. It's all to do with the humidity, is what people are complaining about. But that being said, the British are always complaining about it, whether it's either too hot or too cold or too rainy. So there's no winning really. It's just always kind of crappy.
Right. So would you characterize yourself as a socialist or a social democrat, or what?
Democratic socialist, I think.
Democratic socialist. So could you because people in the United States, I know Bernie Sanders called himself a democratic socialist, but really what he was a social democrat.
Yeah, he's a social democrat.
People here in the U.S. are confused about the difference, because it's just the words are switched. So I would like to get your perspective on the difference and what actually a democratic socialist is.
Well, so first of all, social democracy works within a capitalist system. It has no intention of moving to a socialistic or communistic one. It's all about social reform within an economy that remains capitalistic. So introducing things like universal healthcare, and Bernie Sanders was on a lot about that. Whereas democratic socialism, it starts with sort of social democracy. Also, certainly the variety in the UK starts with sort of social democracy. So reforms such as the NHS. So certainly post-war Britain, Labour won a massive majority, and they introduced the NHS, social housing, and things like that with kind of a social democratic manifesto. But after that, it's kind of about nationalising public services, so water, the railways, and then from there, once you have public ownership, once you have public ownership for the major services, that's effectively what seizing the means of production is. So if you then go into the next election and the electorate saying yes, we agree with this. That's where the Democratic part comes in. You don't become suddenly all autocratic, and the electorate says yes, we want some more of this, and you get elected again. And you start moving towards nationalising more services, so less key services, and from there you transition from sort of socialism to more communistic things. But I mean, it takes a very, very long time.
So
That's where the democratic things comes more in.
Would you characterize yourself as fundamentally anti-capitalist then?
No, not fundamentally. At the moment, I'd say it needs heavy reform, and that's where the social democratic part comes in. And then once we've established that, then we can move into better alternatives. But until we see the results of social democratic policies elsewhere, or certainly more social democratic policies. I know in the UK, for example, the NHS social housing has gone down very, very well. Public ownership of the railways before they went private under the Conservatives gave a really large profit. And then after that, we need to be looking at sort of more socialistic things. So inherently, I'm not at the moment, as the political system is, not anti-capitalistic. If Labour were to win the next election and start nationalising some of the public services, then it would turn more into anti-capitalism, certainly, on my front.
So, are you against the concept of private ownership of the means of production, or would you rather people have private property?
Private property is okay. I'm talking more about economically, so how public, because if you've worked all your life, of course you deserve to have private property. I'm not disputing that. Why what I'm against economically of capitalism is the fact that it is all privately owned rather than distributed fairly with the workers. And that's not saying like, oh yeah, a doctor's going to earn the same amount as kind of someone that collects rubbish. It doesn't work like that. But it's more about giving the public services the public investment and ownership that would benefit the economy more greatly.
All right. Well,
so it's all kind of about economic benefit.
You know, I find it funny because in the United States, if you were to ask somebody their opinion on whether the rail line should be private or public, they wouldn't know what to say because that's not even on the national radar, you know. Yeah. So I think here our train lines are private, but really trains aren't that big a deal here, I guess. The only train I'm near is the one that
they're a lot bigger here.
Really?
Yeah. Most people traveling to work kind of by train or bus or whatever, because it's a smaller country, so you know.
I guess from where I live about 50 miles away from New York City, I think. So when I go in there, I take a train. But anyway.
Yeah, because most people. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Anyway.
But the problem I have with socialism is that in say a free market capitalist system, you have you would have private ownership of the means of production, and the market would set the prices of things and the labor, and which the price of things would include the price of labor, which is starting at whatever low minimum wage you would set and then goes upwards. So if you say, well, I want the doctor to earn this amount of money proportional to the hard laborer, if you're talking about a construction worker or a plumber or something, then what ends up happening is you fundamentally switched the balance or messed with the balance of the market, and it's no longer an efficient division of prices and labor. It's now you're introducing a bureaucratic aspect into it, and you have to watch that to make sure that it doesn't drift into any sort of instability. And then with the whole taxing the rich thing, when you tax the rich too highly, the rich leave, and then there's no incentive to get rich because they'll just take all your money away. So that's why, in my view, most socialistic countries have been very poor throughout history and have not had great living conditions. You know, the USSR, communist China, although they've become significantly less socialist, there would be Cuba, Venezuela. And so I think in a Western country where you have democracy, you also need a good deal of capitalism because people don't. Right, so you're going to end up with large scale poverty if you have the market being controlled by the state. So is there anything that you want to say?
That's where the democratic aspect in socialism comes in. But you talked about the market as an entity.
Yeah.
Socialistic policies is obviously not going to favor the market. That's why Trotsky, for example, is very much for international socialism or communism, whatever you want to call it.
Sorry, could you just repeat the earlier thing, like when you started? Because I think
Bound
you cut out
to
on my end.
fail. Did I?
Anyway, so right, I mean, when you're talking about the market, you're talking about all the interactions between economic bodies, whether they be people or corporations. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah, I can just about hear you, but I think it's kind of cutting out a bit more now.
Right, I don't know why that's happening. It seems to be stable now. Anyway, so the thing with like Trotskyism.
Yeah, I mean this may well be like a good place to stop because we just keep cutting out. I mean, we can pick this up another time if you want.
All right, well then I guess I'll let you go because we're kind of shifting topics away from the UK into general economics. So
Well,
I think that'd be a good place to stop.
all right. So it's been nice debating you.
All right.
So I'll catch you up some other time. We'll organize another debate.
Sure. I'll probably talk to you in a podcast later then.
Sure. All right. I'll see you then.
See you then.